Hey students, this is Mr. Moore here with our week 33 notes. And we're almost to the end of the school year. And this is always the time where we start gearing up for AP tests. And we try to make this class as practical as possible. When a student takes an AP class and they hear, oh, I'm taking an AP European history class, it feels like a world history class because, of course, European countries really have dominated the politics and economics and well, even the conflicts of the last several hundred years. And as we get into the modern world, it's kind of where we need to stop lecturing and start paying attention to what's happening in front of us. And it's always harder to see things right in front of your face rather than looking back at things. You know, it's like if you've ever had a boyfriend or a girlfriend and you look back at that relationship, you can always be like, oh man, that was a bad relationship. But you don't necessarily know that when you're in it. And sometimes that's the way it is with history. We don't even know really what's happening fully to its extent, and we can't see the ramifications until later. So that does make it challenging, you know, and everybody's got an opinion on current politics or the situation that we're having right now. Like this year, we've had school closures due to COVID-19. But what's the full term, you know, ramifications of shutting down society? What's going to be the impact on our economy? What's the long term, you know, mental health of students? You know, as a as opposed to a regular school year. You know, in some ways, there's things that are better. You know, no school shootings. Um, you don't have any bullying because schools are shut down. But what are the long-term ramifications of people being shut up in their home life? If their home life is good, maybe nothing, but if their home life is bad. So those are those things that are happening like right now in the moment. The situation is happening and unfolding in front of us. And sometimes it's hard to grasp exactly how that affects us. But as a history teacher, we're going to be trying to tie in what happened in the past to what's going on right now. And that is an always constant thing in a good history class. We're not just learning about facts from the past. I got my air quotes going on here. Facts from the past. We're trying to make connections and understand the development and processes to how we got to where we are. And ultimately, if we don't act on what we learn, then it really doesn't affect us, right? That's the ultimate level of learning, is to take a principle and apply it to yourself and then to make change. So as we look at the world right now, you know, where is there conflict? In 2021, where is conflict happening in the world? And you can go find these kind of maps, similar ones to it. Kind of looking at as where's the most devastating, you know, issues happening in the world today. And if you look at this map right here, you see that Africa and the Middle East have probably the most intense conflicts in the world today. North America, in North America, the most troubled place is Mexico. So, as a good history student, we have to ask what's going on there, what led to those issues. Mexico is a country that has serious issues with drug trafficking, and there are drug cartels that control certain parts of Mexico. Mexico thrives on tourism. That can drive tourism away, so it can affect the economy and the general stability of the country. Also, you have to consider that Mexico is next to the richest, most powerful economy in the world, the United States. And so that's why there's such a huge drug trafficking issue, is because the biggest market in the planet Earth is the United States, right? That's where the money is. So obviously the country right next door, that can create those issues. So those geopolitical issues, who are we close to? Who are we next to? Does it affect us? And that's been, playing into modern politics. If you've learned anything in this class, hopefully you understand the scramble for Africa and European colonialism in Africa, how it affected Africa in the 1800s, and of course, throughout the 1900s, Europeans diced apart that continent, and how they diced it apart, and how those empires eventually fell and how that plays into some of the armed conflicts in Africa today. And then, of course, the same thing could be said about the Middle East and some of those issues. um, so, in general, that's what we're talking about here. History, it's all about critical thinking skills. We're always asking why. If you're not asking why, you're not a true student of history. Because a true student of history doesn't just memorize facts, but they use data and information and concepts to make connections and to understand how and why things are the way that they are. For instance, think about how fast military technology has changed in the last 100 years. If you take the best military on the planet Earth in 1914 and you put them up against the best military on the planet Earth from 2014, it's not even a competition. I mean, we're going from having maybe like bi-wing planes to having jet fighters and intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? Nuclear technology. And if you go back from say 1914 to 1814, there's way less change that happened. Still, a 1914 army could tromp on an 1814 army. We're talking Napoleon at his best versus, like, say, the Imperial German army, right? Up to, like, say, the United States military in 2014 with aircraft carriers versus, you know, Napoleon and his 12 pounders that could shoot 5 miles. And that was a big deal. Why do I bring this up? Because if you were to take like an army, say from 1000 BC, like, pre Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great is what, 325 BC. So we go, several centuries before Alexander the Great, and we pit them up against, like, say, a medieval army. There's not going to be that much difference, is there? Right? Anybody before the 1800s had no vehicles that could go faster than a horse could run. So what changed everything in human history is the Industrial Revolution. And I think armies are really interesting. I know there's a lot of obscure historians out there that might say, what if we put Julius Caesar's army up against Alexander the Great's? That's 300 years different. Would that make a difference? Or say we pit Julius Caesar's army up against, say, close to 1,000 years later, say William the Conqueror's army. Who's going to win? And there's not much technological difference between those, even though it's 1,000 years. But again, you start dealing with armies. Let's even take, like, say, the United States Army at the end of World War II, 1945, and you put that up against, say, the U.S. Army in, say, 1965 or 1975, even a couple decades could radically change things. So the pace of change has really increased exponentially in the last century or two. And I think looking at militaries is one profound way to kind of see how quickly the pace of change has happened. By 1920, there was less than 2 billion people on the planet Earth. But by 2020, there's almost 8 billion. So think of the change that's happened in the last 100 years. Even if military history doesn't interest you, think about the population on the entire planet Earth. I mean, you can look at all kinds of data, and there's all kinds of charts that look like this. But in general, most historians agree that the population of the entire planet Earth never reached over 1 billion people until we get into the 19th century. And then the population of the world has just exploded. So, what's happening in the 1800s that's affecting that? Why have things changed so much in the last 100, 200 years? Right? And again, that's why we start asking those questions and digging out the answers. It's not about memorizing some random, obscure facts that you'll never use in your life unless you play on Jeopardy game show, or you want to trounce on your friends in a trivia night, at the pub. Why does this matter? Why does history matter? Why should we study history? Because we have to ask these questions. What's changed? And how significant is that change? And where are we going to be in a few years? Population wise, conflict wise, those are the questions we're asking. If you walk out of this class less ignorant than when you walked in, we're successful, no matter what your grade is and no matter how you score on an AP test. Do you see the world for what it truly is? I mean, when you look at the planet Earth, right, and you look at the percentage of human beings, you know, how much does your country matter? What percentage of the world's population is in your country? If you live in China, you're looking at almost 20% of the world's population under one government. If you live in India, you're right behind that. That's where the vast majority of human beings live. So, what countries really matter? China, India. If we're talking about pure human numbers, if we're talking about political power or economic strength, then obviously the United States is one of the more important countries. Okay. But I think it's really interesting to note how much of an Asian world we live in, right? And how much it's changed over the last few years. I was in high school in the 1990s. And when we talked about the GDP of China, how economically strong China was in 1990, it didn't fall in the top 20, top 30. I mean, we're talking it was in the maybe 40 or 50 rank, depending on which year you're looking at the economic data. But now China is the number 2 economy on the planet Earth. And if you look at photos of like the economic capital of China, obviously the political capital is Beijing. But if you look at the economic capital of China, Shanghai, and you look at photos from what Shanghai looked like in 1990 to even the year 2010, that 20-year gap, China has just done unbelievably crazy things, right? And it's taking its place as one of the leaders of the world, whether you like that or not, right? You can say, well, oh, I don't like their politics. Well, the vast majority of humans live in China. And like it or not, the GDP of China is going to surpass everything else very soon, right? I mean, that's the way it's heading. We can't predict the future, but we can use data to understand the world that we live in. And China is a major player. They are nuclear power. They have the world's biggest population. They have the world's second biggest economy. So it's something we've got to take into consideration, how much it affects all of us and how much can change in just a short time. So what's the world going to look like 20 years from now when you're not in high school, right? I'm recording this in 2021, and so it's gonna be interesting, right? We can't predict the future, but we can certainly use data and information to make some smart analysis, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do. So, what does it look like right now in 2021? China has the world's biggest population, followed closely by India, and a long way behind them is the United States as far as population goes. And we've pulled up numbers, and they're always changing. So it's always best to probably Google it and try to use a reliable source, like maybe say that the CIA World Factbook. That's a government agency that's collecting data around the world. Maybe you have problems with the CIA or the US government, but if you could find a credible source to try to get some numbers, that's about the best we can do. Economically, who's the most important? The United States has the biggest GDP. It doesn't necessarily have the biggest per capita income, which is a whole different playing field. There's some really nice countries out there that maybe their economy is not as big, but their population is so much smaller that the wealth is spread out a lot more evenly. And so their standard of living might be better than the United States. China has the second biggest GDP, followed by Japan. And Japan's not even close to China. And it's not even close to the United States. So the number 1 and 2 spot are pretty competitive and close. But that does mean they dictate a lot of things in the world. Natural resources, who gets what, right? Land size, of course, Russia is number 1 and Canada is number 2. And the United States is number 3. But that's where it really starts to get interesting, where we really start to take the data and instead of memorizing lists and facts, we start to analyze things as we've done in class. The population of California, one of the 50 states, is more than the country of Canada, and yet they're the second biggest country on the planet Earth. And if you look at the population of Bangladesh, which most people can't point to on a map, and you compare the population of Bangladesh to the population of Russia, you start to maybe change your opinion about, is the world overpopulated or is it just horribly mismanaged? So again, the smarter you are, the more information you have, and if you can use that in a critical way, along with having, like some of those reliable characteristics that make you a good person, then we can make this world a better place. It's not just information. If you want to understand how big the economy of the United States is, this is a map, similar GDPs in 2018. If you look at, like, say, California, the economy of California alone could compete with Great Britain, the United Kingdom, which is, fifth or sixth biggest economy on the planet Earth, right? The economy of Canada would be compared to the economy of Texas. So we've placed the names of other countries that have similar size GDP. For instance, Mexico, our neighbor to the south, the state of Florida makes as much money per year as the entire country of Mexico, right? That's what I'm talking about. So you look at some of these countries that have giant populations like Pakistan, and you look at the population of, say, Missouri, and you're like, they're not even close. Little tiny Hong Kong, just that little piece of China, is probably one of the most economically powerful parts of China, and that could compete with, say, Minnesota. So I think this is fascinating. And if you look at different years, maybe it kind of changes, you know what I mean? But you're getting similar data and information, making these comparisons. So I think that's fascinating. And again, it's not about memorizing facts, it's about not being ignorant. By 2015, the United States, the world's largest economy, accounts for approximately 25% of nominal world GDP. 25%. But look, another 25% is the European Union. Remember, the European Union is those rich European countries working together to compete with the United States. If we were to go back 100 years, we were to go back 200 years, Europe dominates the planet Earth economically. So how come the wealth shifted from Europe to the United States? World War I and World War II is the answer. Europeans blew each other up, and the United States built weapons for them to do that. Okay. Another way to look at the world besides money and population size is world faith, right? Where are the different religions in the world? And in this class, we've taken a lot of time to talk about the different religions. So when I say religion and I say Christianity, there are different types of Christianity. And if you've been in my class, you know that there are three basic types of Christians. There are Catholics, there are Orthodox Christians, and then there are Protestant Christians. So if you look at a country like the United States, clearly it's a Christian-based country because we believe it's the year 2021. That's 2021 years since the birth of Jesus. We have 7 days in our weekly calendar because God made the world in 7 days, right? I mean, all these pieces of our society and culture that we just take for granted, you've got to pay attention to where those roots come from. So Spain was one of the most Catholic countries around, and so everywhere that Spain took over, and Portugal, right, are still very Catholic. So if you go down into Latin America, I got my air quotes going on here, Latin America, that would be very, Catholic oriented. If you come here to the United States, it would be very much Protestant. And Denmark, that owns Greenland, of course, you'd also get a lot of Protestantism. You'll see there's a lot of Catholicism still left in Europe with spots of Catholic, but spots of Protestantism. You can also see very clearly the Muslim part of the world, the Islamic part of the world. So, and there's two different brands of Islam, basically, right? There's Sunni and there's Shiite or Shia Muslims. And so you can kind of see the dispersion of Islam throughout the world, which is generally the Middle East, North Africa, and through trade and conquest, we got Indonesia, right? The Dutch East Indies, Hinduism, okay, and forms of Chinese religion, although China is still communist, so it shuts down a lot of religious affiliation. Then you got some random Asian country that's very Catholic, and you have to ask questions. Why are the Philippines a very Catholic Christian country? Well, that's because it was one of the first places in Asia that was taken over by the Spanish. And then it was taken from the Spanish by the Americans in the Spanish American War, and then you get a switch of power, and then the Philippines is now an independent country. But we can trace the roots of why places are the way they are using history as a tool, right? So again, I think it's very interesting to look at world cultures. How do you see the world? Well, that depends on where you've been. Have you ever been outside of Apple Valley? That's where I'm recording this from, right here in California, Southern California. Have you been to other parts of California? Because that might open up your understanding of the world. Have you been outside of the United States? Right? Have you traveled to Europe? Have you traveled to Africa or South America or Asia? Because that's going to change your perception of the world. And the more experience you have, the more knowledge you have, then hopefully it will make you less ignorant and more polite and nice. And hopefully we can eradicate ignorance, right? Something that I learned in college and taught my first year in the classroom. I used to do this lesson, if the world were 100 people lesson. It was one of my favorite lessons to do. But it's crazy how much things have changed over the last 20 years. I can't teach that lesson anymore. It was a lesson that I learned when I was in college, and it's not even true anymore. So just because you learn something here in class or you learn something here in school, there's so many things that could change by the time 20 years from now. Those things might not be true. So that's why we have to always pay attention to current events. It's a requirement in my class to pay attention to current events, so you're at least aware of some things that are going on in the world in front of you. um, Traveling may be one of the best educations you can ever get. If we were doing this live, I might just share some of my personal experiences, from wandering around the Sahara Desert in Morocco to swimming in the Nile of Egypt, to bumming around New South Wales in Australia with my family, visiting Katoomba and the Three Sisters out in Australia, or spending some time just on the base of the Andes Mountains in Chile, or sampling different foods in Buenos Aires and Argentina. These are some of the experiences I had, or taking a tour of the national diet in Tokyo, when we were in Japan. So the more you travel, what a great education. I actually took an entire semester off of college, right in the middle of college, and wandered around different parts of the earth. And I think it's a great experience. I highly recommend it. And I've tried to help my kids see that. I have 4 kids of my own, and most of them have been to 20 or more countries around the world. So hopefully that helps them have a better understanding of the planet Earth and their part in it. Um, here's some random things that I think about, and this might seem random, but it's like one of those modern issues that affects all of us. The U.S. government pays some farmers not to produce food in the United States. They're called farm subsidies because they want to moderate and regulate prices of goods like wheat and milk prices and stuff like that. And yet we have starvation in certain parts of the world. So that begs us to ask questions. Why are we doing this? And is it a good idea? We talk about hunger in the world, and yet we have one of the richest countries on the planet Earth paying some of its farmers not to produce food. And we're also, destroying some good productive farmland to build strip malls and to, build factories. Are we setting ourselves up for problems in the future? We used to categorize the world as first world countries, rich industrial countries, and we used to call countries that were having maybe issues and small economies and were old colonial powers. We used to call them like third world countries. We try not to use that word anymore, um, but we call them maybe less developing countries or developing countries. But if you look around the world, and you think about the problems we have, there are some people who complained about having to do their school from home, even though they had a computer given to them and they had internet access. And, some of them chose not to do school because they'd rather watch YouTube or, play video games. And then there are some real problems in countries where there's civil war going on and, people are dying and there's human trafficking. I mean, there's some legitimate problems, and then there's sometimes we complain about things that aren't real problems. If you got half of the world that lives in poverty, living on less than, 250 per day, or less than $10 per day, you've got some serious issues going on in a country. And so those are some things that we really should be paying attention to. Okay. A little video that it's a great little video, and I highly recommend it. But poverty and who has what, and why do certain countries have wealth and others struggle? Those are the kind of questions that we can find some of the answers when we look at history. So, how many people are there on the planet Earth? I think you should get into your head that there are over 7 billion. If you Google it right now, it'll probably be closer to 7.5 billion people. I do encourage you to use the CIA World Fact Book. It has information on all countries around the world. Theoretically, the CIA is supposed to gather intelligence, information, right? We think of them as spies and, spying on people, but really it's supposed to be intelligence gathering so that we can make informed decisions. That's theoretically the idea of the CIA. So I don't believe the world is overpopulated. I just believe it's horribly mismanaged. I showed a video earlier in class that all the people on the planet Earth, all 7.5 billion of us, could live in a land area the size of Texas with a 30-foot by 30-foot plot of land for each person, And even if that data is slightly obscured, even if you doubled it, there's plenty of open space. I mean, if you just you just look at things that I've talked about, like even if you do a use Google Maps and look at Apple Valley, which, remember, California has as many people, more actually, than the country of Canada, the world's second biggest country. And if you look in California, which by far has the biggest population in the United States, and you zoom out of Apple Valley, you'll see how much open space there is. So again, I don't think it's overpopulated. I just think it's horribly mismanaged. And you can see how many more people India and China have than the United States. We're not even close. There are more people in China than the United States, plus a billion, right? Again, all of that's happened in the very recent age. If you go back to as far back as you can find a record of civilization, there's not much record of civilization. I mean, you get into some really obscure archaeology if you get too far back, right? Because writing is invented, somewhere before 3000 BC. And different scientists will argue on that exact date. But you don't have much record of human beings before, much before 3000 BC. And if all of human history goes from 3000 BC, when we have written record, to today, the population of the world has never really cracked a billion until the last century, and then we start doubling exponentially. So where is that going to end or stop, or how much trouble are we going to get into? I think that's really, really fascinating. I mean, look at this right here. When I was born in the 1970s, the world population has doubled since then. We're not quite to 8 billion, but we're getting pretty stinking close to that, and we're sitting here in 2021, even with a pandemic. And you start to realize, wow, only 5% of the world's population lives in North America, where 61% lives in Asia. This is an Asian world, right? And it kind of just gives you perspective. I think that's one of the key words here, right? And of course, we talked about the countries economically powerful, and I think it's good to know who's in the top 10, right? And I'll show you a list here in a minute. A lot of them are European countries or countries that Europeans have boosted up, right? Most of the countries that are on the poorest of the GDP list, like if you click on this link right here and you were to look at like the top countries by GDP, almost all the poorer ones would fall in on the continent of Africa. Africa has been shafted by Europeans, right? That's what we talked about. Um, a 2015 report says that as many as 60% of humans don't have a flushing toilet, and yet we have a rich country that's paying its farmers not to produce food. You can see how it's mismanaged, right? And so hopefully we can correct some of these injustices and help people to live fulfilled lives. The European Union has about the same size economy as the United States. That is roughly 27 countries of Europe working together. They use the euro, most of them. I say 27 roughly because Great Britain is still in the process of Brexiting, right? Exiting the European Union. So that's the joke, of course, Brexit. GDP, of course, when I keep using that terminology, that's gross domestic product, the total value of the economy. Again, however, though, as we look at per capita income, um, well, let's take a look at some different things that I think maybe might add some insight for you. The world's richest 62 people own as much wealth as 3.6 billion people who make up the poorest half of the global population. That was in a Time magazine article in February of 2016. So we've got some real wealth distribution issues. If we've got 3.6 billion people who have as much money spread out between 3.6 billion as the 62 richest people, no wonder there's some discontent and there's some people whose realities are very different. If you grow up in the United States where you can walk into a Costco and there's food literally up to the ceiling, they have to use a forklift. There's so much food. We have a problem eating too much food in our country, right? And then there are some places where there's starvation, civil war, and conflict. And those are the real questions people care about. That's why the social sciences matter. That's why history matters. Okay. Um, Again, this is like looking at the top 10 economies, but these charts are just ranking them by GDP. Um, and again, you can see that there's slight alteration depending on if it's the IMF or the World Bank or the United Nations who's putting out the data. But the European Union would fall in the number 2 category if its economy was one single country. And then there's upstart places. When I was growing up, I never even heard of Dubai when I was a kid. But now it's like where the rich play, right? And the world's tallest building in 2021 is in Dubai. And, they have like indoor ski resorts in the middle of the desert. And you're like, wow, so what's going on there? We start asking questions, why does Dubai have so much money, as a part of the UAE? Because there's only so much oil there, right? I mean, so what's driving these economies? And these are questions we ask ourselves. What are the roles and the responsibilities of government? This is the kind of stuff it's fun to talk about in class, right? You have a discussion. You don't even make it through the whole lecture because you're having those type of discussion. And that's really one of the sad parts this year. I mean, I can talk at the computer all I want and pre-record this on YouTube, but you miss that dialogue and discussion, right? And what happens if our country or what happens if the government fails in our country? There are countries, they have failed governments. And what does it look like in Libya or Syria, right? Or Yemen, some of these places where governments are failing, or Venezuela, You know, we've had some political strife in our own country, but we're still a functioning, democracy, a functioning republic, right? What are the roles and responsibility of citizens in a democracy? You know, we have to be educated. If we're not educated, then are we really making choices, right? Or are we just going along with the crowd, or whoever has the best sound bites, or or what our parents told us to do, or the way our teachers taught us? Do we have a brain? Can we think for ourselves? What is power, and how is it gained and used and abused or justified or controlled in our modern world? These, fascinating, fun discussions. Can one individual really make a difference? We're still talking about some of these individuals. Did Hitler make a difference? Did Martin Luther King make a difference? Can one individual really make a difference in the world? That's ultimately only a question you can answer. If I've taught you anything, then I hope you could make a claim, provide some evidence, and tie it together with reasoning, and we'd say, hey, there's a pretty smart person, right? So again, it's difficult to have this kind of a lecture posted on YouTube because it really is so much better with interaction. How can the abuse of power be avoided? Can we preserve our republic? Going into this modern world is, what's going to happen to the United States? There's never been an empire that hasn't fallen. And what's caused those empires to fall is a question that Americans should ask themselves. Are they decaying from, rotting from the base up? You know, who should when should a society control individuals? When should we look out for the collective good? And why do we need laws? And how can we have laws that are fair to everyone? Is it ever okay to break the law if it's an unjust law? Some of our heroes used civil disobedience to break bad laws to get that information out there, to get people to think and to question and to bring it up in the courts. And then we start to ask questions like needs and wants. Do we really need to produce this much waste in our country? In my economics class this year, I was talking to people about the percentage of food that Americans produce that never makes it to somebody's stomach. So the statistics we were looking at was somewhere around 42% of food that's produced in the United States never makes it into a stomach. It's wasted, thrown away at a restaurant, goes bad in a grocery store, thrown out of production, rots in the field. You name it. How involved should the government be in our lives? These are questions that people are asking, especially with this whole last year, COVID-19. Some people are ready to be up in arms because the government's telling them to wear a mask. And some people say, it's just a mask, wear it. We can all do this to kind of, remind us all that there's a disease out there spreading around. Or how deadly was the disease? When we start looking at data, we get conflicting information. You know what I mean? This many people died of COVID. Yeah, but there's been no reports of anybody dying of flu. So did COVID, was the flu even a thing this year? And how bad could a pandemic really get? Something like Ebola was spreading around the globe at the rate that COVID was. And I know there's people that died of COVID, but these are the questions. And where do we get our information from? Right? And what goods or services should a government provide? And how much freedom do we give up for the chances of security? Right? And then we start to ask ourselves, we start to think about some of the things going on in the world: human trafficking, modern day slavery, the whole Israel Palestine conflict, or two nuclear powers like Pakistan and India that hate each other, that partitioned when the British Empire pulled out of British India, the crown jewel, or the fact that North and South Korea have technically been at war since the end of World War II, and North Korea is developing nuclear weapons, or the whole fact that China claims Taiwan as a part of its country, even though most people know it's an independent country, or the fact that the United States has fought two wars in Iraq. Why? Why? And how's that working? And what are we doing to reconstruct their country? And what about Afghanistan? The British tried to take it over back in the late 1800s. And the Russians invaded in the 1980s, right? Well, end of the 70s, but into the 1980s. And the United States has still got troops there now, right? And the ethnic cleansing of the Balkans, or all of the issues with the Middle East and the fact that they control the vast majority of the oil in the world, or the fact that Sudan split apart on religious and cultural lines, and there was a genocide that happened in Sudan, and people aren't talking more about it, even though we still talk about the Holocaust from World War II, which was bigger, but still, why aren't we talking about Sudan? International terrorism gets a huge, chunk of the news. But what about the drug trade and the serious number of people that have died in Mexico over that drug trade? Organized crime, nuclear weapons. We talk about that like it's a history thing, like the Cold War, but there's still enough to eradicate ourselves. And chemical or biological weapons, people are asking that at the beginning of this COVID crisis. Was this developed in a lab in China? Did China purposely invent this disease, thinking that they might be able to control it? Because certainly it got out of control, even in their own country. What's the fate of the European Union? Will it still dominate global affairs and international markets? And migration. I mean, Americans, our last president was talking about building a wall along our southern border because people are coming across the border in droves. Of course they are. If the country of Mexico makes about as much money as the state of Florida per year, of course people want to move into the United States. It's economically smart. And people are moving from Africa and from the Middle East into Europe, and it's disrupting the culture, and there's tension, right? Third world or less developed countries and how we can get them online. And of course, pandemics and disease is a huge issue and how that affects the economy, not to mention all of the things that have been going on. And there's even things that are happening just in the United States. Honestly, one of the last things I usually do in class is a project where people get to pick a topic and kind of do their own research on one of the issues that are facing either the world or our own country, and then do like a presentation, on it in class. And it's one of my favorite parts of class. Unfortunately, because we're only meeting twice a week this year, it's not going to happen this year. But it really is one of my favorite topics, and I've heard some great student presentations on all of these, kind of modern issues that affect us. Um, this is just one example. Percentage of the U.S. population receiving food stamps. You know, and that's not even think about the COVID numbers. 4 or 5 years after this, COVID numbers, are going to be rocketing, and stimulus checks, right? Every American, how can we afford to give every American that much money? You know, with a government that doesn't have any money, they only get what they get from taxes. So I mean, there's issues, and here's the other concern I'm going to bring up again one more time: where you get your information from doesn't you don't I think you got to be really careful about taking it as fact. If you understand where you're getting your news from, whether it's right or left or centric or neutral or more fact based or more opinion based, that will help you to understand what you're seeing in front of you. And that may be the most important information that could be shared with you. Understanding where you're getting your information from and learning how to think for yourself and learning how to take information with a grain of salt and making a claim, backing it up with evidence, adjusting it, tying it together with reason. Consider what you can do to make your country or the world a better place. So before you get depressed thinking about all the bad stuff, remember all the good stuff too, right? And what we've done as a nation, what we've done, as a species. And then consider what you can do to make our country or our world a little bit better. And hopefully that's where we could leave you on for this last lecture on modern issues and conflicts in the world. Thank you for being with me here. Next week, I am going to talk a little bit about the AP test and some specifics, just to remember what's going to be tested on the AP European History test. But thank you for being with me, and I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot in this AP European History class. I know it feels like a world history class. It really is. But I hope you learned a lot, and you didn't just learn facts. You've become a critical thinker, and you start to ask the questions why, and then you apply what you learned to make this world a better place. Thanks, guys. See you next week for one last lesson.